The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. How sure are you about your beliefs? By the end of this video, I hope it is a little less sure than at the beginning. The French philosopher Rene Descartes once sat down and aimed to question every one of his beliefs. He wanted to see what he could be certain of and where his knowledge was open to serious doubt. He recommended that each person should do this at least once, as a way to check their own reasoning and realize just how little they truly know. And today, we shall follow in his footsteps. We will go on a journey to explore the ways our thinking can go horribly wrong, so that we can fight against our own intellectual arrogance and become a bit more like Socrates, who was proclaimed the wisest man in Greece because he knew that he knew almost nothing. So, let's start at the beginning with some of the most irritating yet fascinating thinkers of the ancient world. And if it's your first time here, then welcome. My name is Joe Foley, and this is Unsolicited Advice. 1. Philosophical Scepticism. It could be argued that the history of skepticism began when the first toddler asked why until their exhausted parents had to reply, just because. But, as a philosophical tradition, it emerged in ancient Greece with the philosopher Pyrrho of Elis and some others. These thinkers aim to show that there are foundational problems with how we form beliefs, which mean we can't really be certain of anything, or in some cases, that we can't even know anything. However, much of the surviving work in ancient skepticism comes from Sextus Empiricus and his Outlines of Pyrrhonism. The ancient skeptics were quite odd by modern standards. They were not particularly interested in coming to conclusions, but instead suspending judgment about as many things as possible. Rather than find truth, their main aim was to sow doubt, which makes them a fantastic historical example for our current exercise. Empiricus records the various different ways that the skeptics questioned the knowledge of those around them, who they referred to as dogmatists. But I want to focus on his 5 modes, which he says that he gathered from recent skeptical philosophers, and they probably ultimately come from Agrippa, who was an earlier skeptic thinker. While Empiricus wanted to use these to undermine all knowledge, today we can just think of them as ways to question our own beliefs. I'll just go over 3 of them now. Empiricus's first mode is the mode of dispute. This sort of does what it says on the tin. It is challenging your own position by reflecting on the strongest arguments that can be put forward against it and all of the incredibly clever people who disagree with you on this particular conclusion. For example, I personally do not believe in God, but a good way for me to start challenging this position is to reflect on the number of people I deeply respect who do believe in God, and sometimes believe in him very strongly. This does not directly argue against my position, as that would be a mere appeal to authority, but it does encourage me to at least consider that I might have missed something that they had seen. Alternatively, I can ask what arguments seem to have convinced these clever people that God does exist, and then steelman them as much as possible. I quite often do this on the channel, where I try to explain why these arguments can be so convincing, but also why I personally am not convinced by them. Well, not yet at least. There is still hope for my soul. This exercise has had a real impact on my beliefs. It's made me realize where I might have misunderstood some key arguments for God, like Aquinas' 5 ways, and where some of my own responses to these arguments were just much weaker than I had initially considered. He then moves on to the mode of infinite regress. This is where we continually ask what grounds our beliefs until we find ones that we cannot justify or just get to our foundational assumptions. Empiricus thinks that the only other option is that our justifications are an infinite regress, and he finds this epistemically unacceptable. A good modern philosophical theory of foundational assumptions comes from Ludwig Wittgenstein and his idea of hinge propositions. A hinge proposition is a belief that forms the base-level preconditions for all or most of our other beliefs. It cannot really be justified, since for one belief to justify another, the justifying belief must be more strongly held than the justified one, but it also can't be doubted or refuted, since for one belief to refute another, the refuting belief also has to be held more strongly than the refuted one. One purported example of a hinge proposition might be the law of non-contradiction. That is, that P and not P cannot be true at the same time. Funnily enough, Aristotle gave something close to a hinge-like reason for this law, saying that it is impossible to have any coherent thoughts without it, rather than demonstrating that it is true in the more traditional sense. For our skeptical quest today, we don't necessarily need to go this far. Rather, we can take from the general structure of Empiricus's mode. If we start with our conclusion and then work backwards, where do we find a premise that we're not sure of? Where do we find our justifications wanting? And what are the assumptions that we just have to make for our belief systems to even function? And what might happen if we changed those assumptions? Thirdly, there is the mode of relativity, which is questioning how the same object or claim can be perceived under different circumstances or according to different people. Empiricus outlines 10 ways of doing this, and we certainly won't go through them all, but a good everyday example of an argument like this is there's no accounting for taste. This phrase is often used to mean that if people have different tastes, this can't be resolved because there is no one truth about the situation. It is genuinely just a matter of opinion. For example, a snack I quite often have is ketchup on toast. Most people find this disgusting, and why wouldn't they? It sounds awful. But there is no absolute or even objective standard for something being tasty. So when we say this food is good or this food is disgusting, we are often using it as shorthand for I really like this food or I think I'm going to be sick. These are all ways to throw doubt onto our pre-existing beliefs by questioning the process by which they are justified. The modes of dispute and relativity find whether there are other equally as justified ways of viewing a situation, while the mode of infinite regress asks us to identify our base assumptions and our premises when we are making our argument, and ultimately see if any of them are flawed or indefensible. However, this is not the only kind of philosophical skepticism. Famously, Rene Descartes conceived the evil demon hypothesis. This aims to undermine certainty in almost all of our beliefs by imagining that an evil demon had seized control of our perceptions and could deceive our thought processes. Descartes eventually thought he overcame this with his own complex philosophical system, which started from the idea that, at the very least, I cannot doubt that I exist, since in order for doubt to exist, there must be a doubter, and I call that doubter I. Of course, most people are not troubled by this kind of skepticism, since we don't tend to aim for complete certainty when we form our beliefs. But, again, I think the exercise is illustrative. For example, when I'm doing research for these videos, I have a few academic publishers that I regularly go to, like Routledge, Cambridge University Press, Oxford University Press, and so on. I also have a number of journals that I will search through to find articles on whatever subject I'm writing about or interested in. I am relying on them in much the same way that Descartes relies on his senses to make claims about the external world. And there is much more reason to criticize the state of academic publishing than there is to doubt all our senses, and we'll definitely be coming back to this point later in the video. And this holds for almost all secondary sources of information. Very few of us come to our opinions just using primary data from our own senses and research that we've personally conducted. We rely on information ecosystems that are fallible. Again, I'm not suggesting that this means we should throw out all of our beliefs. Far from it. It is just to encourage us to reflect on where the weak points in our belief formation process might be, and perhaps add a little bit of skeptical spirit into our worldview. But, of course, this is not the only reason to doubt our beliefs. We can also draw from modern psychology to talk about the human tendency to employ deeply flawed reasoning chains and unreliable heuristics to come to some of our most treasured conclusions. But this channel is all about learning and critical thinking, which is why I recommend you check out today's sponsor, Brilliant. Everyone knows that learning subjects like maths and science can be incredibly difficult. These subjects can get abstract and dense, and sometimes they can make you want to tear your hair out. But this is where Brilliant comes into play. They have courses on everything from programming with Python to classical mechanics to learning how AI language models work, each crafted by award-winning research teams. The best part is that with Brilliant, you learn by doing, making the information stick in your head much more effectively. It's also just a great antidote to scrolling, since with their app, you can complete quick lessons or exercises on the go, rather than getting lost in the quagmire of an internet argument or doom scrolling on social media. If you want to build on some of the concepts we've been learning about today, you can check out the logic courses on Brilliant, which are great tools for aiding your critical thinking and just seeing what logic is about. To try everything Brilliant has to offer for free for a full 30 days, go to brilliant.org/unsolicited advice or scan the QR code on screen. Or you can just click the link in the description, whatever you prefer. You'll also get 20% off an annual premium subscription, so please do check that out. But anyway, back to the video. 2. Thinking is bloody hard. When Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky conducted their landmark series of studies into the flaws of human reasoning, one of their conclusions is very well appreciated by almost every first-year logic student in the world. Thinking strictly rationally is difficult, time-consuming, and often inefficient. It can feel like a Sisyphean punishment, going through each of your premises to check whether they are supported, and then checking each inference chain to ensure that you haven't made a mistake or used a rule incorrectly. It gets easier over time, sure, but it remains a cognitively arduous process. If we had to go through this every time we came to a conclusion about something, then nascent Homo sapiens would have been sat around debating probabilistic inferences regarding big cats before being quickly eaten by the tiger hiding in the bushes. Sometimes it is better for our survival to have a quick, rather fallible process than a slow, more accurate one. Often, making a decision, any decision, is more pragmatically successful than cracking out the natural deduction systems. This makes me sad, but unfortunately, I've not yet managed to make the universe comply with my rather peculiar preferences. As a result, many of our beliefs come not from what we might loosely term rational thinking, but from these less reliable methods. The heuristics mentioned by Kahneman and Tversky are numerous, but I'll just go through a few of them now. For example, it's been found that people judge certain statements as more plausible or insightful when they were pleasant to listen to. In a study by McClone and Tofig Baksh, the phrase "woes unite foes" was judged as more accurate than the phrase "woes unite enemies," despite them having exactly the same meaning. This is known as the Keats heuristic, and it suggests that when we judge a proposition, we also take into account its beauty, rather than merely evaluating its potential factual content. This is not necessarily a bad thing. After all, beautifully written novels have probably used this bias to challenge some dominant ideas that might have otherwise gone totally unquestioned. But it does imply that our opinions are not always formed with due deference to the facts, but other potentially distorting qualities play a role as well. And this is just the tip of the iceberg. One of the most notorious examples of a cognitive bias is the mere exposure effect. This is when the same stimulus is viewed more positively when it is experienced repeatedly and thus becomes more familiar. It's linked to the illusory truth effect, where repeated exposure to an idea or proposition makes it seem more plausible or even more truthful. One hypothesis explains this by appealing to cognitive fluency. That is, if we hear an idea more frequently, it becomes easier to process, and we associate an idea being cognitively fluent in this way with it being true. Thus, if we hear an idea repeatedly, we are more likely to believe in its truth, though the effect is strongest for initial repetitions and tapers off somewhat after that. Again, this is not always bad. Sometimes, hearing a claim repeated by multiple independent sources actually does mean it is more likely to be true. However, knowing about this bias gives us another stimulus for doubt. Did we really hear this proposition repeated by independent sources, or did we just hear it repeated? Then there are the various biases grouped under the heading confirmation bias. This both refers to our tendency to seek out information that confirms our pre-existing views rather than information that challenges them, and also just our general propensity to seek to verify given hypotheses rather than falsify them. Thus, to use Kahneman's example, if I ask you what is the likelihood of a tsunami hitting the west coast of the US in the next 30 years, you are likely to overestimate because you may form the hypothesis a tsunami will hit the west coast of the US in the next 30 years, and then look for information that would verify this, rather than looking for evidence that would disprove the initial hypothesis. Kahneman even says that the mere image of a tsunami in your mind may lead to this sort of overestimation. In addition, we have the halo effect, where if we already like one thing about someone, we are prone to think other good things about them. We might be more likely to conclude that someone is kind just because they are attractive, or funny just because they're generous. We also tend to overemphasize information that is available to us, and effectively pretend that we know everything when we instinctively form opinions or beliefs, ignoring that there will be a whole host of things that we don't know that we don't know. Perhaps my favorite of Kahneman and Tversky's findings is that when we are asked a very complex question, we tend to substitute in a simpler one and then just answer that one instead. For instance, say I asked someone what their opinion was on the claims in the last non-fiction book that they read. There is a chance that the person will sit back, devote careful thought and mental energy to evaluating the book's propositions, and then come to a reasoned conclusion about the quality of the argumentation or the research. But Kahneman thinks they are much more likely to ask themselves, how did I feel when reading this book? If they felt understood or clever or interested, they are likely to say that the book is good. Whereas if they were confused, unhappy, or bored, then they are likely to say the book was bad, regardless of what the truth of the book's contents actually were. But this also holds for far more serious matters. If we are asked, what do you think of this political policy? We are also likely to think, how did this policy make me feel? And let that dictate our answer. That feeling, in turn, will be influenced by a whole host of factors, like whether we like the speaker, whether it sounds like something our team would support, and so on. Regarding statistical claims, we often do not pay enough attention to sample size. We tend to overestimate how generalizable our personal experience is, and we neglect the base rate of events. All of this means that we're just rubbish intuitive statisticians, which allows us to then be fooled by statistics that might have been collected, processed, or presented poorly. And trust me, we will be revisiting this in the next section. Interestingly, many of these biases were preempted in an essay by the German philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer called The Art of Being Right, which aimed to satirize the way orators and other communicators can use someone's baser instincts to convince them of whatever they want, and to win performative debate. The sarcastically recommended tactics include appealing to authority, attacking your opponent's character, straw-manning them, using metaphors to frame the debate in your favor, and a whole lot more. It's actually quite a fun exercise to go through Schopenhauer's essay and match almost every one of his points to modern work on cognitive biases. We could easily go on here. There are findings like the Wason selection test, which shows how we misuse logical rules if they are not in a familiar context. Or we could point to errors in reasoning in some of the most persuasive and influential speeches of all time. But I think this section has served to throw sufficient doubt onto many of our beliefs. It's important to note that Kahneman and Tversky are not outright pessimists. They do not think that humanity is totally unable to come to well-reasoned or true conclusions on anything. They prefer to model the mind as having roughly two thinking systems. System 1 uses intuitive judgments to come to relatively swift conclusions, and also falls prey to many of the reasoning errors we've discussed in this section. However, System 2 can potentially be much more rigorous in its reasoning, and they are much more optimistic about its ability to reliably come to robust, defensible positions. This is one reason why I think learning about these biases and heuristics are so important. We can't eliminate them, and nor would we want to, since this would just mean a huge increase in our cognitive load. But we can slowly learn to recognize when they are leading us astray. So this is another tool we can question our beliefs with. If we think about the way we've made a particular conclusion, did it seem to come to us intuitively as the obvious answer? Do we think we used heuristics to get to it, or did we take the time to carefully check the reasoning process to see if it holds water? When I do this exercise, I am always forced to swallow my pride and admit that there are a whole host of views where I either can't quite remember how exactly I came to conclude that, or where I think, if I'm being honest with myself, I need to go back over my reasoning with a fine-tooth comb and check whether one or more of these biases is at play, because I suspect they might be. But next, let's move on to one of the hottest topics in both philosophy and public discourse: the way in which our current information landscape may work against our aims of gaining knowledge and insight, and instead simply mislead or confuse us. If you want to help me make more videos like this, then please consider becoming one of my wonderful supporters on Patreon. The link is in the description. 3. Epistemic systems and their faults. As we discussed earlier in the video, none of us form our beliefs in a vacuum. We are well past the point where most of our opinions are based on personal observation, and it is a good thing too. If each person had to discover everything for themselves from scratch, then the pace of human advancement would slow to a crawl. But with this interreliance, more potential faults in the belief-forming process begin to creep in. And this is yet another route of skeptical questioning that we can apply to our knowledge. And as a result, further the exercise on the table. At one level, we can point to how even our best sources of knowledge regularly produce false beliefs. The mature scientific method is one of the greatest discoveries of mankind. It has been carefully crafted and refined over thousands of years until it was articulated in an incredibly sophisticated form by Karl Popper, and it continues to undergo developments even today. However, it also ideally works by self-falsification. That is, by taking pre-existing theories and then working to challenge and disprove them. This naturally means that the vast majority of scientific hypotheses and theories have been, strictly speaking, false. They've just got better and better at predicting observations, which I would argue is basically what we're after anyway, but then again, I am a filthy pragmatist and my position is very controversial. But then, when we say that we know the conclusions of our best scientific theories, that seems a little bit premature. We do not really know they are true, but rather that they are the best current means we have to predict future phenomena. If what we're after is justified true belief, then this suggests that even our best ways to form knowledge don't quite give us that. If you want to look into this argument in more detail, it is called the pessimistic meta-induction, and there is a whole subfield of philosophy of science looking at it, so please do check that out. For our purposes, our skeptic questioning is brought on by something slightly different. This pessimistic meta-induction suggests that maybe truth is not what we are after in inquiry most of the time, but rather we are simply seeking the most effective ways of approaching the world and predicting events. This does not so much challenge the scientific process, but rather throws doubt upon the way we think about knowledge itself. But even this is only when the scientific method is being followed well or honestly. There are numerous examples of scientific malpractice or fraud which can undermine our confidence in reported conclusions. For example, Jan Hendrik Schön was a German physicist who claimed to have made leaps and bounds in the study of organic materials being used to make semiconductors. This earned him a huge amount of acclaim, and his findings were published in some of the most prestigious journals in the world, including Nature. However, it was later revealed that he had falsified much of his data, and a university spokesman called the scandal the biggest fraud in physics in the last 50 years. To take another example, the Dutch social psychologist Diederik Stapel had over 58 papers retracted when it was found he had misrepresented or just outright made up his data. By its very nature, we can only know about malpractice in science when it comes to light, though it's vital not to overstate things here. A meta-analysis by Daniele Finelli estimates that only 2% of scientists have, even once, knowingly fabricated or modified data. And I've spoken on the channel before about how the peer review process works as a check to maximize the reliability of scientific findings. But if our current quest is just to doubt everything that we can, then this is another question we can ask. How well do we really know the scientific findings that we cite? Are they replicated by multiple different sources, or are we overly weighting one study that supports our conclusion? This does not invalidate scientific conclusions by any means. It is just another possible way our belief formation process can go horribly wrong. And, of course, these are just the examples from our strongest epistemic communities. Most of our opinions are not formed by the examination of peer-reviewed publications, but instead we form them in much less rigorous communities. We inherit beliefs from friends or family, or just the environment we are enmeshed in. This can easily become a self-reinforcing cycle. On the one hand, we gravitate towards people who are similar to us and so likely to share at least some of our opinions. And on the other hand, a group of people who agree on something are also likely to reinforce those agreed upon views. If we're not careful, we can fall into what Naretta Coerge calls communities of belief buddies, where we insulate ourselves from critical opinions and instead simply parrot our own views back to one another. Considering the findings of psychologists like Solomon Asch that our views are heavily influenced by those around us, this can be a real hindrance to the rigor of our thought processes. Another skeptical question is naturally presented. How often do we talk to people or communities who vehemently disagree with our views and genuinely hear what they have to say? And where have we converted our world into one big echo chamber? To make matters worse, even true propositions can be misrepresented to be misleading. I've used this example before, but the UK newspaper The Guardian once published an article titled "Global Shark Bite Deaths Doubled in 2023, with 40% occurring in Australia." This headline consists entirely of true statements, but it still leaves a misleading impression. Rhetorically, it makes it seem like shark attacks are a major problem, but then it turns out that shark attacks rose from 5 instances to 10, and all of a sudden the headline really seems like overkill. Especially in popular reports of scientific or statistical findings, all manner of misrepresentations can creep in, even when they're not intended. If you would like 2 very readable books on this phenomenon, I recommend Bad Science by Ben Goldacre and How to Lie with Statistics by Darrell Huff. Stuff like this can become a real issue because, as I said, most of us are not trawling academic journals to come to our opinions, and they also think that this is a deeply unreasonable burden to expect busy people to take on. I'm a YouTuber, I don't have a real job, so I have less of an excuse. Navigating the information landscape is made even more difficult because news reporting has an economic incentive to grab our attention as much as possible because that's how they make money. And, as a result, it has to balance the accuracy of its headlines with them being sexy. I have to do this as well, trying to jazz up video titles while also trying not to veer off course into the realm of clickbait. But information outside of these particular economic structures is still subject to its own pitfalls. The democratization of information online, where almost anyone can say almost anything and have it read by relatively large numbers of people, provided they make it attention-grabbing enough, has led to a dizzying amount of falsehoods passed around as if they are unquestionable facts. A study by Michela Di Vicario and others found that information often spreads online based on its ability to tap into a pre-existing narrative rather than its reliability. This aligns with other findings suggesting people are likely to evaluate online claims based on whether they are consistent with some pre-existent belief or attitude. Unknowingly, we may have formed our beliefs based on sources we took as far more reliable than they actually are, and also dismissed sources that we really should have taken more seriously. And this is only the start. We could talk about how corporate or state interests sometimes distort how information is collected or reported. We could discuss how other improper incentive chains lead to false propositions gaining significant traction. We could expand on how social dynamics play on the very cognitive biases that we mentioned in the last section. But I think that may be enough doubt sowing for now. But here we encounter a problem. While we want to encourage critical thinking, it is also easy to fall into a sort of epistemic nihilism where we say we just can't know anything, so we may as well give up. This was part of ancient skepticism's original goal, and they hoped that the permanent suspension of judgment would eventually grant them peace. But this suspension of judgment would also make it very difficult to take action on almost anything. So instead, I think that we can find a sensible middle ground by taking a slightly more nuanced view of how we define our beliefs. 4. Beliefs, partial beliefs, and fuzziness. We often think of beliefs and knowledge as sort of binary concepts. That is, either you know something or you don't. Either you believe it or you don't. This is partly what can make skeptical challenges so daunting. They threaten to plunge us into total disorientation, where all of our beliefs and all of our knowledge dissolve in front of our eyes and are blown away by the wind. But I think this is far too hasty. We simply do not need to view belief and knowledge in this way. We can adapt our concepts to incorporate our doubts. This is the wonderful world of partial beliefs. And I think it can help us steer our ship of knowledge between the Scylla of despair and the Charybdis of dogmatism. Bear in mind, this is just a brief introduction to the study of partial beliefs. It can get very intense and very mathematical, but in its broad strokes, it is incredibly intuitive. At base level, a partial belief is just a belief that we are not totally certain of. In this sense, most of our beliefs should probably be partial beliefs, except for maybe incredibly simple analytic truths like all bachelors are unmarried or all triangles have 3 sides. But, to again draw from Kahneman and Tversky, we do not often appreciate just how uncertain most of our beliefs are. System 1, broadly speaking, prioritizes decisiveness over reflection, and, as a result, struggles to recognize uncertainty. As Kahneman himself puts it, conscious doubt is not in the repertoire of System 1. It requires maintaining incompatible interpretations in mind at the same time, which demands mental effort. And this makes a lot of sense. If you think about it, when we are in most casual situations, we don't tend to ask, how strongly should I hold this belief? Even if we reflect upon whether our opinions are justified, we often treat them as if they are either totally unjustified or totally justified, without making room for this middle ground of uncertainty. But the framework of partial beliefs can come in real handy here. To use the simplest possible mathematical framework, the theory of partial beliefs asks us to estimate a number between 0 and 1, which represents the strength with which we hold that particular belief. This idea of strength can be interpreted in various ways. One popular one is to reduce it down to what odds you would be willing to bet on that belief. I know this is a far-fetched example, but imagine I had you hooked up to a machine that would make you feel good if your bet was correct, and bad if your bet was not. If you were, say, 2/3 confident in your belief, then it would be rational for you to make a bet when the odds were 2-1 against you. That is, when you stand to endure double the pain and a single unit of pleasure. This would make your bet reasonable because your confidence aligns with the potential reward you are being offered. Of course, you would also take any bet with better odds than this, but it would be irrational to take a bet with any worse odds than this. If we like, we can expand upon this with a whole host of mathematical rules and constraints borrowed from a mixture of fuzzy logic and probability theory, such as the confidence in P and not P summing to 1, or we could incorporate Bayes' theorem and conditional probability to compute more complex belief structures. Of course, in reality, we are unlikely to assign precise numbers to our beliefs, but the general framework is incredibly helpful. It allows us to view these skeptical questions not as eliminating our knowledge entirely, but as questioning how confident we really ought to be in some of our beliefs. We can go through our belief formation and our justification processes, see where the weak points are, and then, if we can't fix them, we can mentally adjust our confidence level downwards slightly. The thing is, in some ways, most people already know that they are not certain in their beliefs. If we are actively questioned, we don't tend to say that we're certain about almost anything. We admit that our political views, our opinions on history, and our judgments on one another are all fallible and very much open to revision. We also just forget this most of the time when we are in the thick of our daily lives and when we're having discussions. I have found that one good way of getting into this partial beliefs mindset is to ask how much you would bet that your opinion is true. I think this is slightly more intuitive than the odds version, even if I think that the odds version more neatly maps onto the maths around partial belief. For example, would you bet your wallet, your house, a kidney, your life, the lives of your family? This sort of question can immediately alert us to the uncertainty that pervades our beliefs by raising the stakes of the situation until we have to admit we would be reluctant to carry on. The skeptical philosopher Peter Unger has also suggested asking, but do I really know that, until we are made aware of our own uncertainties? Though his argument goes much further than this, and he is a much more extreme kind of skeptic. But it is also fair to ask, what is the point of this skeptical exercise? Why do we want to potentially become much less certain in some of our deeply held beliefs? Well, I think the benefit can be twofold. The first is that our beliefs will be more epistemically responsible. The Scottish philosopher David Hume once said, "A wise man proportions his beliefs to the evidence," and identifying and recognizing uncertainty allows us to allocate this proportion with much greater care. But secondly, it can also be a much-needed antidote to our pride and our intellectual arrogance. It is well known that we tend to cling to our beliefs even in the face of contradictory evidence because we find being wrong about things rather embarrassing. We can see it as evidence that we are unintelligent, and understandably, we often rebel against this conclusion. But paradoxically, this cuts us off from learning new things and so becoming more knowledgeable. However, with a touch of skepticism, we already recognize that our beliefs may be incorrect, and by thinking of our beliefs as partial, we become less attached to their conclusions. Thus, I hope that occasionally adopting this attitude can make us more curious, more likely to spot the flaws in our beliefs, and ultimately, a little bit wiser. But if you want to explore a little bit more about the broken nature of our information landscape, then click here to learn about pseudoscience, cults, social media influencers, and what they have in common. I hope you enjoyed this video and have a wonderful day.